He didn't scream. He didn't beg. He stood there calm, almost peaceful, while the entire apparatus of the Third Reich prepared to end his life in the most brutal way imaginable. And the worst part, the cameras were rolling. Johann Richard wasn't a general. He wasn't a politician. He wasn't even a soldier in the traditional sense. He was a man, flesh, blood, doubt, and conscience, living inside a machine that had no room for any of those things. And the moment he chose his conscience over the regime chose to make an example of him. What you're about to hear isn't just an execution story. It's the story of how Nazi Germany weaponized death itself, turning killing into performance and performance into terror. Every frame of what happened to Johann Richard was intentional. Every witness, every camera angle, every sound calculated. Because the Nazis didn't just want him dead. They wanted everyone watching to feel it. And trust me, by the end of this video you will. Before we go any further, if you're new here, welcome to Nazi Dark History. This channel exists because forgetting is the most dangerous thing we can do. Every video we make is deeply researched, brutally honest, and told the way history deserves to be told, without filters, without sugarcoating. Hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and let's make sure these stories are never buried again. Now back to Johann Richard, because where this story begins is almost as shocking as where it ends. It's 1890s Germany. The country is proud, ambitious, and quietly building towards something it doesn't fully understand yet. Johann Richard is born into a working-class family, the kind of family where you learn early that life is about discipline, loyalty, and keeping your head down. He grows up ordinary, almost painfully so. But here's the thing about ordinary people in extraordinary times. History has a way of finding them whether they want it to or not. By the time Hitler consolidates power in 1933, Germany has already changed. The air itself feels different, heavier, watched. Neighbors report neighbors. Friends disappear in the night. And the German legal system, once one of the most sophisticated in the world, gets quietly gutted and replaced with something that looks like law but functions like a weapon. The People's Court, Volksgerichtshof, is established in 1934. And this is important. Write this down mentally if you have to, because this court is where Johann Richard's fate will eventually be decided, and it is not a court in any real sense of the word. It is a theater, and the verdict is always written before the curtain rises. To understand what happened to Richard, you first need to understand the man who would preside over his fate, Roland Freisler, president of the People's Court. A man so terrifyingly theatrical in his cruelty that even some senior Nazis found him uncomfortable. Freisler didn't conduct trials. He performed them. He screamed at defendants. He mocked them. He cut them off mid-sentence and hurled insults like a man possessed. And he did it all while the cameras rolled, because these trials were filmed, edited, and sometimes screened for the German public as propaganda. The message was simple. This is what happens to traitors. By the early 1940s, Germany is deep inside World War II. The early victories, France, Poland, the Low Countries, have given way to something uglier. Stalingrad has already happened. The Eastern Front is bleeding Germany dry. And internally, the Nazi regime is becoming more paranoid, not less. Dissent, even whispered dissent, is now a death sentence. A joke told at the wrong table, a letter written to the wrong person, an overheard conversation in a factory. People are being arrested for thoughts. This is the world Johann Richard is living in when he makes his decision. And it is the bravest and most fatal decision of his life. Here's where the story shifts, and where Richard stops being a background character and becomes the center of everything. The exact nature of Richard's resistance has been debated by historians, but what is documented is this. He was accused of Wehrkraftzersetzung, a term so chilling it deserves its own pause. It translates roughly to undermining military morale, and under Nazi law, this was punishable by death. What could constitute undermining morale, criticizing the war, doubting the Führer, expressing reality in a country that had outlawed it? Richert, it appears, spoke the truth to someone who wasn't ready to hear it, or someone who was ready to report it. The Gestapo didn't knock politely. They never did. They came in the way regimes always come for people they've already decided are guilty, with certainty, with force, and with the paperwork already signed. Richert was taken, and once the Gestapo had you, the math was brutally simple. The arrest was the conviction. Everything that followed, the cell, the interrogation, the courtroom, was procedural theater designed to launder state murder into something that looked like justice. He would have known this. Every German knew this by now. And yet, when they brought him before the court, something remarkable happened. Johann Richard looked at Roland Freisler, the most feared judge in the Third Reich, and he did not look away. What happened next inside that courtroom was recorded. The footage exists, and it is one of the most haunting things a human being can watch, not because of the violence, but because of the dignity. Last time we left Johann Richard standing in front of the most dangerous courtroom in Nazi Germany. Arrested, accused, already convicted in everything but name, and yet something in him refused to collapse. Most men brought before the People's Court arrived broken. The Gestapo made sure of that. Richard arrived upright. And that single detail, that quiet, stubborn dignity, was about to make Roland Freisler furious. Picture the courtroom, and I mean really picture it. It isn't the cold, sterile halls you might imagine. It's draped in Nazi flags, deep red, aggressive, suffocating the room with symbolism. The judges sit elevated, robed, positioned to look down on the accused like God's passing sentence on something beneath them. There are cameras. There are carefully selected witnesses. And at the center of it all, Roland Freisler, already leaning forward, already performing. He wasn't interested in evidence. He was interested in submission. Because a broken defendant was useful propaganda, a defiant one was a problem. The moment Freisler opened the proceedings against Richard, the room understood what this was. Not a trial, a demolition. Freisler's method was psychological before it was legal. He would attack a defendant's identity, their masculinity, their intelligence, their right to exist as a German citizen, all before a single piece of evidence was formally introduced. He called defendants cowards, worms, rats gnawing at the foundations of the Reich. He screamed, literally screamed, voice cracking, face reddening, in a way that should have looked unhinged but somehow, in that room, in that era, passed for authority. And the defendant was never allowed to speak freely. Every response was interrupted, twisted, weaponized back against them. But here is where Johann Richard does something almost incomprehensible given the circumstances. He doesn't perform the role Freisler needs him to perform. He doesn't weep theatrically. He doesn't grovel. He doesn't collapse into apologies designed to beg for mercy that was never coming anyway. Historians who have studied the transcript and the footage note something striking about his demeanor, a stillness that reads less like resignation and more like clarity. As if somewhere in that nightmare of a room, Richard had already made peace with what was coming. As if he understood that the only thing left within his control was how he faced it. And he chose to face it like a man who had nothing left to be afraid of. That choice cost him everything, and it gave him something Freisler could never take. The verdict, when it came, surprised no one in the room. It never did. Death, pronounced with the same theatrical certainty Freisler brought to everything, loud, righteous, dripping with ideological venom. The sentence was framed not merely as punishment for Richard specifically, but as a message to every German watching, reading, or hearing about it afterward. This is the price of doubt. This is the price of speaking. This is the price of being human in a system that has outlawed humanity. The speed of these proceedings is something modern observers find almost impossible to process. from arrest to death sentence, sometimes days, sometimes less. The Nazi legal machine wasn't designed to find truth. It was designed to produce outcomes at maximum velocity before public sympathy could form. Now we have to talk about something that many history channels gloss over because it's uncomfortable. But this channel exists precisely for the uncomfortable truths. The method of execution chosen for Richert, and for many convicted by the People's Court, was the guillotine, or in some cases, hanging by piano wire. And the choice of method was not incidental. It was deliberate, designed to strip the condemned of any sense of warrior's death, soldier's dignity, or martyrdom. Heinrich Himmler himself had noted that such methods were meant to feel shameful, to make the condemned seem not like heroes, but like criminals disposed of like refuse. The Nazis understood optics, they understood symbolism, and they weaponized both even in the mechanics of killing. This is the detail that separates the Nazi execution machine from almost anything else in modern history, and the detail that makes the Richert case particularly haunting. They filmed it. Not secretly, not apologetically, officially. The executions of those condemned by the People's Court were sometimes recorded on Hitler's direct orders. The footage of the July 20th conspirators, the men who tried to assassinate Hitler in 1944, was filmed and reportedly screened for Nazi leadership the same evening. Whether Richert's execution was filmed for the same purpose, as evidence of state control or as warning material, places it within this broader, deeply disturbing architecture of performative death. The regime didn't just kill its enemies, it documented the killing. It turned the final moments of a human life into an instrument of governance. And that right there is what separates authoritarianism from mere cruelty. It's the system behind the cruelty, the intentionality, the bureaucracy of it. Here is where history softens slightly, not to comfort you, but because the human details matter. In the hours before executions, condemned prisoners were sometimes allowed to write final letters. Whether Richert wrote one, and whether it survived, remains unclear from available records. But we know from the accounts of others who passed through the same system what those final hours looked like. A cell, a priest, if requested, a last meal that was rarely eaten, the distant sounds of a facility continuing its grotesque routines around you, guards who sometimes showed flickers of discomfort they were professionally required to suppress. And then mourning. There is something almost unbearably human about the fact that even inside the most dehumanizing machine ever constructed, the condemned still had to wait, still had to sit with the knowledge of what was coming, still had to find, somewhere inside themselves, a reason to keep breathing until they no longer could. Johann Richard walked to his execution inside a system that had spent months trying to erase everything he was. His name, his dignity, his right to have ever existed as a free man with free thoughts. We've walked through the world that built this moment, the courtroom that performed justice without delivering it, the man who stood inside the worst machine in human history and refused, quietly, stubbornly, completely, to break. Now we arrive at the part of this story that no historian can make comfortable, and no YouTube script can fully prepare you for. Because this is where Johann Richard runs out of time. Execution mornings in Nazi Germany followed a protocol, and the existence of that protocol, the checklist, the paperwork, the scheduled timing, is itself one of the most disturbing things about this entire era. Hannah Arendt called it the banality of evil. The idea that history's worst atrocities weren't always committed by monsters foaming at the mouth, but by ordinary people, following procedures, clocking in and clocking out. Someone scheduled Johann Richard's death the way you'd schedule a meeting. Someone signed the paperwork. Someone checked the equipment. Someone made sure the cameras were ready. And somewhere down a corridor, Richard was already awake, already knowing. Let's talk about the footage directly, because this video's title references it, and you deserve honesty about what that means. The footage that exists from Nazi executions, particularly those connected to the People's Court era, is among the most difficult historical material in existence, not always because of graphic violence, sometimes because of the absence of what you expect to see. You expect chaos, resistance, screaming. What the footage often shows instead is something quieter and far more disturbing: the mechanical efficiency of a state that has practiced this. Guards who move with routine familiarity, officials who look bored, a process so normalized within its own context that the humanity of the person at the center has been administratively removed before the camera even starts rolling. Richard's case sits within this broader documented reality, and what makes it historically significant isn't spectacle. It's the window it opens into how thoroughly a government can industrialize the ending of human lives and still call it law. Here is a detail that doesn't get discussed enough. Nazi executions, particularly high-profile ones, sometimes required forced witnesses, fellow prisoners, factory workers, soldiers, people dragged in specifically so they could carry the memory of what they saw back into their communities. This was psychological warfare turned inward, aimed not at an enemy nation but at the German people themselves. See what happens. Remember what you saw. Tell others what you saw. The regime understood something dark and true about human psychology. Witnessing is contagious. Fear experienced by one person, if vivid enough, spreads to hundreds, and hundreds becomes thousands, and thousands becomes a population that polices its own thoughts because the memory of what it witnessed is punishment enough. Johann Richard's death, like so many others, was designed to keep living in the people who watched it. Now I want to slow down here, because this is the part that matters most. We don't know everything Johann Richert thought in his final moments. History rarely gives us that intimacy with the condemned, but we know enough from this era, from the documented accounts of witnesses, guards, priests, and survivors of the same system, to understand what those moments looked like for men like him. There is a recurring detail across multiple accounts, a detail so quietly devastating that once you hear it, you don't forget it. In their final moments, many of the condemned looked for a face, not a friendly face necessarily, just a human one, someone in the room who was looking back at them not as a prisoner, not as a traitor, not as a propaganda moment, but as a person. Sometimes they found one. A guard who couldn't quite suppress something behind his eyes, a priest who held a gaze a second longer than required, a witness who didn't look away when everyone else did. That small, wordless act of recognition, I see you, you existed, you were real, was sometimes the last human thing a condemned man received. And the fact that people searched for it, even there, even then, tells you everything about what it means to be human. We need to be witnessed, even at the end, especially at the end. After an execution, the Nazi regime had a secondary process almost as chilling as the first: erasure. Families were often not notified in advance. In some cases, they received a brief clinical letter informing them that their son, their husband, their father had been executed for crimes against the state, and that the cost of the execution would be billed to them. Read that again. Billed to them. The bill for the guillotine blade, the bill for the official witnesses, the bill for the paperwork. It was a final act of institutional cruelty so precise, so bureaucratically deliberate, that it almost defies belief. But it is documented. It happened. And it happened to families across Germany who had already lost everything, and were then handed an invoice for the loss. Johann Richard's family carried the weight of his death in a country that had criminalized grieving him. I want to address something directly, because if you're watching this video, you may have already asked yourself the question: should this footage exist? Should we be watching it? It's a fair question, and it deserves a real answer, not a deflection. The footage of Nazi executions exists because the Nazis created it for control, for propaganda, for terror. We did not make it. We cannot unmake it. But what we can do is choose what we do with it now. Watching it without context turns a human being's death into content, and that is wrong. Watching it with context, with the full weight of who that person was, what they resisted, what system killed them, and why, transforms it into something else entirely. It becomes testimony. It becomes a refusal to let the regime's version of events be the only version. It becomes an act of historical accountability. Johann Richard was not a traitor. He was a man who told the truth in a country that had made truth illegal. And the regime that killed him wanted his death to mean submission, to mean silence, to mean this is what happens to people like you. We are here in 2025, watching and discussing his story, because we refuse to let it mean that. History is not a museum. It is not a collection of old events safely behind glass where they cannot touch you. History is a mirror, and the Nazi era in particular holds up a mirror so clear, so brutally unforgiving, that most people instinctively look away. Don't look away, because the conditions that produced Johann Richard's execution did not appear overnight. They were built slowly, procedurally, with paperwork and speeches and laws that each seemed almost reasonable in isolation. The People's Court didn't arrive fully formed. It was constructed piece by piece by a society that kept telling itself it was still civilized while becoming something else entirely. That process, the gradual normalization of the unacceptable, is not unique to 1930s Germany. It is a human vulnerability. It exists wherever power goes unchecked, wherever courts become theaters, wherever the definition of enemy expands quietly, steadily, until it can reach anyone. Johann Richard understood that, and it cost him everything. His name was Johann Richard. He was not a general or a hero in any conventional sense. He did not lead armies or change the outcome of the war. He was an ordinary man who made an extraordinary choice: to be honest in a world that had criminalized honesty, to be human in a system that had outlawed it. And they killed him for it, efficiently, bureaucratically, on camera. But here is what the Nazi regime never accounted for, and what every authoritarian regime throughout history ultimately fails to understand. You can execute a person, you cannot execute an idea. Richard's death was meant to silence. Instead, 70, 80 years later, we are here, saying his name, telling his story, refusing the silence they tried to enforce with piano wire and paperwork and a camera that was supposed to belong to them. It belongs to history now. And history belongs to the people who refuse to forget. If this video moved you, if you feel the weight of what Johann Richard's story represents, then please share it. Not for views, not for the algorithm, but because stories like this deserve to be heard by more than just the people who already know to look for them. Subscribe if you haven't. Every video on this channel is built the same way this one was, with research, with respect for the dead, and with the belief that the darkest chapters of history are the ones we most need to understand. I'll see you in the next one. Don't forget, and don't let others forget either.